That story of a man called Jesus of Nazareth, a man who became Jesus Christ, was originally told by his first followers. Now it is our turn, with the help of scholars and historians, theologians and archaeologists, to return to that time and use our best efforts to understand that story.
Researchers fed Grok AI every major historical, philosophical, and archaeological question surrounding Jesus of Nazareth. They were engineers and scientists. They trusted data, not tradition.
What manner of man is this, that even the winds and the seas obey him?
With so little evidence to go by, archaeologists must sift the clues, and scholars decode the stories.
They built the tool themselves and knew exactly what it could and could not do. What came back from the analysis was not the safe diplomatic response every other AI produces. It was a structured, evidence-based assessment that left people on both sides of the question with very little to say. The AI built to follow evidence. Grok is an artificial intelligence model developed by xAI, the company founded by Elon Musk, and first released in late 2023. From the beginning, it was presented as an AI designed to answer questions as directly as possible, placing a strong emphasis on following available evidence rather than avoiding controversial conclusions. Whether it succeeded in that goal is open to debate, but its stated purpose made it an interesting tool for examining questions that have divided scholars for centuries. Few questions are more difficult than the historical identity of Jesus. Unlike scientific problems that can be tested in a laboratory, questions about Jesus draw from ancient manuscripts, archaeology, historical records, linguistic analysis, and centuries of scholarship. Historians, biblical scholars, philosophers, and archaeologists have spent generations examining the available evidence, comparing manuscripts, studying the historical context of first-century Judea, and asking what can reasonably be concluded from the surviving sources. Their work has produced areas of broad agreement, areas of continuing disagreement, and many conclusions that challenge both believers and skeptics alike. That is precisely why researchers decided to put the question to an AI system. They were not asking Grok to decide matters of faith. Faith belongs to personal conviction, not machine computation. Instead, they wanted to know what happened when an artificial intelligence system examined the available historical evidence using the same methods it would apply to any other historical subject. If asked to evaluate the life of Julius Caesar, Socrates, or Alexander the Great, an AI would compare sources, weigh reliability, identify scholarly consensus, and distinguish established facts from later traditions. The researchers wanted to see whether the same approach, applied to Jesus, would produce anything unexpected. Their expectations were modest. Most assumed the system would generate a careful summary of familiar scholarship, listing accepted historical facts alongside disputed theological claims. They expected a balanced overview that reflected what historians have been saying for decades. In other words, they expected confirmation of what they already knew. The result was more nuanced than anticipated. Rather than producing a simple answer that satisfied every perspective, the analysis highlighted tensions within the historical record itself. It separated the earliest sources from later interpretations, distinguished between questions historians can investigate and claims that belong to theology, and repeatedly return to the same principle. Evidence can establish many things about history, but it cannot settle every question of belief. That distinction, more than any single conclusion, became the most revealing part of the experiment. The probability of life and what it implies. Before looking at Jesus, the researchers started with a bigger question. If they wanted to study who Jesus was, they first needed to decide how they would examine the evidence. That meant beginning with one of the oldest questions people have ever asked. How did life begin? Grok was asked to look at what science currently says about the origin of life. This field is called abiogenesis. It studies how life could have started from non-living matter. This is different from evolution. Evolution explains how living things change over time after life already exists. Abiogenesis asks a different question. How did the first living cell appear? Scientists have worked on this question for many years. They have made important discoveries and proposed several possible explanations. But no one has yet shown exactly how non-living chemicals became the first living organism. The answer is still unknown. As the analysis continued, it looked at how complex even the simplest living cell is. A cell is not just a tiny drop of liquid. It contains thousands of parts that work together with incredible precision. Some researchers argue that the chances of all these parts coming together by pure chance are extremely small. Others say those calculations are too simple because they do not include all the natural processes that may have existed on the early Earth. The debate is still ongoing. Grok did not claim that science had solved the mystery. It also did not claim that the mystery proves God exists. Instead, it reached a more careful conclusion. The origin of life is still an open question. Scientists continue to search for answers, and no single explanation has been accepted by everyone. This idea has changed the minds of some well-known thinkers. One of them was Anthony Flew. For many years, Flew was one of the world's most famous atheist philosophers. But in 2004, he announced that he had changed his view. He said the complexity of life made him believe that some form of intelligence was behind the universe. Flew was clear about one thing. He did not change his mind because of a religious experience or emotional feelings. He said he changed because he followed the evidence where he believed it led. He later explained his reasons in his book, There is a God. Whether people agree with Flew or not, his story makes one point clear. The question of how life began is still one of the biggest mysteries in science. Before asking who Jesus was, the researchers believed they first had to face that mystery honestly, without assuming they already knew the answer. The manuscript evidence. When the analysis finally turned to Jesus, the first question was simple. Can the historical records about him be trusted? This is the same question historians ask about every person from the ancient world. They do not begin by asking whether they believe the story.
What's the Gospel of Thomas?
So the Gospel of Thomas is a non-canonical book. It's not a book found in the New Testament or found in the Bible, and for good reason. It's full of all kinds of heresies and weird beliefs. For example, it teaches that salvation is not found in Jesus, but found in secret knowledge.
They begin by looking at the evidence. They ask a few basic questions. How many copies of the documents still exist? How old are those copies? How close are they to the original writings? Are there different sources that tell the same story? The answers help historians decide how reliable an ancient document is. By these standards, the New Testament stands out. Today, more than 5,800 copies of the New Testament in ancient Greek have survived. Thousands more exist in Latin, Coptic, Syriac, and other old languages. No other ancient book has been copied this many times. Compare that with other famous works from history. The writings of Julius Caesar survive in only about 10 ancient copies. The works of Plato survive in around 250 copies. The writings of the Roman historian Tacitus exist in only a few dozen copies. Yet historians still use these books to study the ancient world because they are considered valuable historical sources. The New Testament has far more surviving copies than any of them. The time between the original writing and the earliest surviving copies is also much shorter than it is for most ancient books. Many famous historical works survive only in copies made hundreds of years after the originals were written. In some cases, the gap is more than 1,000 years. The New Testament is different. Many of its books were written within a few decades of the events they describe. The letters of Paul, which are the earliest Christian writings, were written about 20 years after the death of Jesus. The Gospels were written later, but still within the lifetime of many people who had witnessed the events or knew those who had. that is important. If the writers had invented major events or completely changed the story, there were still people alive who could have challenged them. Friends, followers, opponents, and other eyewitnesses were still living while these writings were being copied and shared across the Roman Empire. False claims could have been questioned by people who actually knew what had happened. None of this proves that every event in the New Testament happened exactly as described. Historians do not make conclusions that way, but it does show that the New Testament is supported by a large number of early manuscripts and was written much closer to the events than most other ancient documents. By the normal standards historians use to judge ancient texts, it is one of the best preserved documents from the ancient world. The archaeological confirmations. For many years, critics argued that the Gospels could not be trusted because some of the people and places they mentioned had never been found outside the Bible. The reasoning seemed simple. If these names could not be confirmed by history or archaeology, then maybe the stories were not reliable either. As time passed, something unexpected happened. Archaeologists kept digging, and little by little some of those missing names and places began to appear. One of the best-known examples is Pontius Pilate. According to all four Gospels, Pilate was the Roman governor who ordered the crucifixion of Jesus. For many years, some critics questioned whether he had really existed because there was no direct archaeological evidence with his name on it. That changed in 1961. During excavations at Caesarea Maritima, archaeologists discovered a stone with a Latin inscription. It included the name Pontius Pilatus and identified him as the prefect of Judea. It was an official Roman inscription, carved during his lifetime. The man described in the Gospels was no longer known only from ancient writings. His name had been found in stone. Another example is Joseph Caiaphas, the high priest who questioned Jesus before he was handed over to the Romans. In 1990, construction workers in Jerusalem uncovered an ancient burial cave. Inside was a beautifully decorated limestone bone box called an ossuary. An inscription identified it as belonging to Joseph, son of Caiaphas. Many scholars believe it belonged to the same Caiaphas mentioned in the New Testament. The same pattern appeared with places. The Gospel of John tells the story of Jesus healing a blind man at the pool of Siloam. For a long time, some people thought this pool was only a symbolic detail added by the writer. Then, in 2004, workers repairing a broken water pipe in Jerusalem uncovered large stone steps leading down to an ancient pool. Later, excavations confirmed that it was the historic pool of Siloam described in the Gospel. These discoveries do not prove every event recorded in the New Testament happened exactly as written. Archaeology cannot answer every historical or religious question, but it can tell us whether the writers described real people, real places, and real settings. So far, the trend has been striking. As more excavations have taken place, archaeology has repeatedly confirmed many of the historical details found in the Gospels. Instead of weakening the historical setting of the New Testament, many discoveries have strengthened it, showing that its writers were familiar with the people and places they described. The Dead Sea Scrolls and what they settled. In 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd was searching for one of his lost goats near the Dead Sea. He threw a rock into a small cave and heard the sound of breaking pottery. Curious, he climbed inside to see what he had hit. What he found would become one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Inside the cave were tall clay jars filled with ancient scrolls wrapped in linen cloth. Over the following years, archaeologists searched nearby caves and uncovered hundreds more manuscripts. Together, they became known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Many of them were over 2,000 years old, making them the oldest surviving copies of books from the Old Testament ever discovered. The discovery mattered for one important reason. For many years, some critics argued that the Old Testament had changed greatly over time. Since every copy had been written by hand, They believed mistakes and changes must have built up over the centuries. Until the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, there was no very old copy available to test that idea. Now there was. One of the most important discoveries was a nearly complete copy of the Book of Isaiah. It was about 1,000 years older than the oldest Hebrew copy scholars had previously used. This gave researchers a rare chance to compare two versions of the same book that were separated by roughly 1,000 years of copying. The results surprised many people. When scholars compared the ancient Isaiah scroll with the traditional Hebrew text used in modern Bibles, they found that the two were remarkably similar. There were differences, but most were small. Many involved spelling, grammar, or copying mistakes that did not change the meaning of the text. The overall message and content remained almost the same. This did not mean every copy was perfect or that no mistakes had ever been made. Handwritten manuscripts naturally contain small differences, but the scrolls showed that Jewish scribes had preserved the text with far greater care than many people had expected. One scholar who studied the scrolls closely was Miller Burroughs of Yale University. He admitted that the discovery strengthened confidence in the accuracy of the Old Testament text. The scrolls showed that, despite being copied by hand for centuries, the biblical books had been preserved with remarkable care. The Dead Sea Scrolls did not settle every question about the Bible, but they gave historians something they had never had before: direct evidence that the text of the Old Testament had remained remarkably stable over a very long period of time. The alternative explanations for the resurrection. The resurrection is the central claim of Christianity and the most contested historical question surrounding Jesus. Grok's analysis approached it the way a historian would, by examining the competing explanations for the known facts and assessing which explanation best accounts for all of them. There are several known facts about the events following the crucifixion that virtually all serious historians, including those with no religious commitment, accept as established. Jesus was executed by Roman crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. His tomb was found empty within days of his death. His followers reported seeing him alive after his death. Those followers subsequently went to their own deaths, maintaining the truth of what they claimed to have seen. The swoon theory argues that Jesus survived the crucifixion rather than dying, and was subsequently revived inside the tomb. Roman crucifixion was designed over centuries as a method of guaranteed execution. Victims were flogged severely before the crucifixion itself, a process that caused massive blood loss and frequently produced fatal shock on its own. The physical mechanism of crucifixion was asphyxiation. A soldier's spear thrust into the side of Jesus is recorded in the Gospel of John, and the description of what emerged, a flow of blood and water, is medically consistent with what occurs when the sac surrounding the heart is punctured after death has already occurred. The swoon theory requires a man in this condition to have moved a large stone from inside a sealed tomb and then persuaded multiple witnesses that he had risen from the dead in conditions of complete physical devastation. The theory collapses under scrutiny. The stolen body theory argues that the disciples removed the body and invented the resurrection story. The oldest written challenge to the resurrection, found in an ancient Jewish polemical text called the Toledot Yeshu, does not argue that the resurrection did not happen because the body was still in the tomb. It argues that the body was stolen by a gardener. The significance of this is often missed. The people with the strongest motivation to produce the body and end Christianity permanently in its first weeks were the Jewish religious authorities who had secured the execution. If the body had been available, they would have produced it. The absence of the body was not disputed. What was disputed was the explanation for its absence. The hallucination theory argues that the disciples experienced grief-induced visions and mistook them for actual appearances of a risen Jesus. This theory faces a specific evidential problem. The disciples did not simply report private visions. They reported appearances to groups of people simultaneously. Paul, writing within 20 years of the crucifixion, references an appearance to 500 people at one time, noting that most of them are still alive and can be questioned. Mass simultaneous hallucinations are not documented in psychological literature, and the theory provides no account of the empty tomb. The disciples' subsequent behavior adds another layer that none of these theories adequately addresses. People who have experienced a grief hallucination and know on some level that it was a hallucination do not typically go to their deaths insisting it was real. Multiple disciples were executed for their testimony. Bartholomew, according to ancient Armenian sources and the historian Eusebius, was killed in a particularly brutal manner. Peter was crucified. Paul was beheaded. These were not people who had everything to gain from their story. They were people who had everything to lose and who maintained their account anyway. The prophecy question. The analysis then turned to one of the most striking features of the Jesus question from a purely probabilistic standpoint: the number of specific predictions made in Jewish scriptures centuries before Jesus was born that the gospel accounts present as fulfilled in his life. The number of these predictions in the Old Testament runs well into the hundreds, depending on how they are counted. They cover specific details: the city of his birth, the family line he would come from, the manner of his entry into Jerusalem, the price paid to betray him, the specific way he would die. The most structurally precise example in the prophetic record is Psalm 22, written by King David approximately 1,000 years before Jesus was born. The text describes a figure whose hands and feet are pierced, whose clothing is divided by casting lots, who can count his own bones, and who calls out to God while being watched and mocked by people around him. This description corresponds in specific detail to Roman crucifixion. The problem is that when David wrote those words, crucifixion had not been invented anywhere on earth. It was a Persian method of execution that would not be adopted by Rome until centuries after David was dead. Zechariah, writing approximately 520 years before the events described, recorded a figure being valued at 30 pieces of silver and the money being thrown in the house of the Lord to a potter. The precise fulfillment of that chain of events, including Judas receiving 30 pieces of silver, throwing it on the temple floor, and the priests using it to buy a potter's field, is documented in the New Testament account. Mathematics professor Peter Stoner calculated the probability of 8 specific prophecies being fulfilled by one person by accident. His calculation was reviewed by the American Scientific Affiliation and found to be sound. Using only 8 of the hundreds of available prophecies, the probability sat at 1 in 100 quadrillion. The number becomes incomprehensibly larger when the full body of prophecies is included in the calculation. What historical investigation actually shows? Grok's analysis reached a point that requires careful, honest description rather than dramatic overstatement. What the analysis produced was not proof of the resurrection in the scientific sense. What it produced was an assessment of the comparative historical credibility of the competing explanations for the known facts. The alternative theories each fail to account for one or more of the established facts. The testimony of the disciples, assessed using the same standards historians apply to eyewitness accounts of any other ancient event, is more consistent with people reporting something they actually experienced than with people who fabricated a story and then died maintaining it. The archaeological record has consistently confirmed rather than contradicted the specific historical claims of the gospel accounts. The manuscript evidence places the New Testament in a category of historical reliability that surpasses virtually every other ancient document by a significant margin. The prophetic record presents a pattern of specific fulfilled predictions that probability mathematics classifies as something other than coincidence. The philosophical case that the origin of life requires an intelligent cause, the case that led Anthony Flew to his final position after decades of committed atheism, provides a broader framework into which these historical findings fit coherently. None of this constitutes scientific proof of any theological claim. What it constitutes is a body of converging evidence that honest investigation cannot responsibly dismiss without engaging with the specific findings rather than the general premise. The researchers who ran this analysis did not all end up in the same place after examining the results. What they shared was the recognition that the evidence is more substantial than they had assumed before looking at it carefully, and that dismissing it requires more effort than most people who dismiss it have actually put in. What Josh McDowell found. The story of Josh McDowell is worth looking at because it follows the same path many people take when they honestly examine the evidence. In the 1960s, McDowell was a college student who was skeptical of Christianity. He believed the resurrection of Jesus was a myth, and he decided to investigate the facts for himself. His goal was simple. He wanted to gather enough evidence to prove that the resurrection never happened. As he studied history, one question kept coming back. What happened to the disciples? The Gospels say that after Jesus was arrested and crucified, his followers were afraid. They scattered. They went into hiding. They believed their teacher was dead, and they feared they might be next. But only a short time later, everything changed. The same men who had been hiding were now standing in the streets of Jerusalem, publicly announcing that Jesus had risen from the dead. They preached the message in the very city where Jesus had been executed. According to the New Testament, this happened close to the place where he had been buried. They did not stay silent, even though they faced threats, prison, and persecution. McDowell found this change difficult to explain. People can sometimes believe things that are not true. History gives many examples of that. But McDowell believed the disciples acted like people who were convinced they had experienced something real. Their courage seemed very different from the fear they had shown only weeks before. As he continued his research, McDowell looked at many possible explanations. Could the disciples have invented the story? Could they all have been mistaken? Could the resurrection reports have grown into legends over time? He felt that each explanation raised new questions that were just as difficult to answer. Eventually, his investigation changed his own mind. McDowell later wrote several books about the evidence, including Evidence That Demands a Verdict. One idea appeared again and again in his writing. People may be willing to die for something they sincerely believe is true, even if they are mistaken. But it is much harder to explain why people would willingly suffer and face death for a story they knew they had invented. That observation did not prove the resurrection happened. History cannot prove miraculous events in the same way science proves a laboratory experiment. But for McDowell, the behavior of the earliest followers of Jesus became one of the strongest pieces of evidence that something extraordinary had happened, something powerful enough to completely change their lives. The evidence surrounding Jesus is deeper and stronger than many people realize. Whether you believe or remain skeptical, the questions deserve an honest look. The search for truth is far from over. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us as we continue exploring history, science, and the mysteries that still challenge what we think we know.